Get your filthy hands off my father, you goddamn parasite. The words detonated in the cavernous, sun-drenched atrium of Blackwood Manor, each syllable a piece of shrapnel tearing through the morning's deceptive calm. Julian Croft stood framed in the grand archway, a titan of industry clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed molded to his rage. His sapphire blue eyes, usually instruments of cold precision in billion-dollar negotiations, were now twin infernos, burning with a primal fury. He had just returned from a 3-day business trip to Singapore, and this was the welcome that awaited him. If you've ever been misjudged, if you've ever had your intentions twisted into something ugly and vile, you know the fire that's blazing in Alara Vance's soul right now. Smash that like button if you feel her shock, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story of resilience and truth travels across the globe. Across the polished marble floor, Alara Vance froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She was perched on the edge of a plush velvet ottoman, one hand steadying the frail, trembling form of Arthur Croft, Julian's 78-year-old father, who was slumped forward, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her other hand was reaching for a crystal glass of water on the ornate mahogany side table. Her own eyes, wide and luminous pools of startled amber, met Julian's scorching glare. I said, "What in the absolute hell do you think you're doing?" Julian's voice was a low growl now as he stalked across the room, the sharp click of his Italian leather shoes echoing like gunshots against the marble. Each step was a measured beat of condemnation. Arthur tried to speak, a weak, fluttering sound escaping his chapped lips. "Julian, son, wait." But his words were a whisper lost in the storm of his son's fury. Julian didn't wait. He didn't even seem to hear him. His focus was entirely, poisonously, on Alara. "You think you can just lay your hands on him like that?" Julian snarled, his voice dripping with contempt as he closed the distance between them. He stood over her now, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You think being a fucking housekeeper in this home gives you the right to get your claws into him when I'm not here?" I was helping him," Alara stammered, her voice a fragile thread against his onslaught. The sheer force of his anger was a physical blow, pressing the air from her lungs. "He was choking. I was just giving him some water. He said he felt dizzy." "Don't you dare lie to me," Julian bit out, jabbing a rigid finger in her direction. "I saw you. I saw your hand on his chest. You're nothing but a damn opportunist, aren't you? A leech." "Julian, please," Alara pleaded, rising to her feet and instinctively taking a step back. Her palms were raised in a gesture of universal surrender, a desperate attempt to ward off the verbal assault. "I would never, ever disrespect Mr. Arthur like that. He's been like a father to me since I started working here." "Oh, that's just priceless," a new voice chimed in, smooth as silk and cold as ice. Isabel Croft, Julian's wife, glided down the sweeping spiral staircase, a vision in a cream-colored cashmere robe that clung to her perfectly toned figure. A delicate wine glass was held loosely in her manicured fingers, and a mask of theatrical sympathy was stretched taut across her flawless face. "I've been warning you about her, darling," she said, her voice a purr of vindication as she descended with calculated grace. "I told you she was spending far too much time alone with him, whispering things in his ear, taking liberties. Now you see it with your own eyes." "That's not true," Alara protested, her voice gaining a sliver of strength fueled by pure indignation. The injustice of it all was a bitter pill in her throat. "I have never—" "Oh, save it," Isabel snapped, waving her hand with the dismissive air of someone swatting away an irritating gnat. "Don't pretend we don't know exactly what this is. The classic, pathetic tale. A poor little girl from the wrong side of the tracks, seducing a confused old man with a colossal legacy, hoping to secure a comfortable future for herself. It's practically a cliché. No, Elara gasped, the word a raw, wounded sound. Isabel's accusation was a poisoned dart that found its mark deep in her heart. What? No, Mrs. Croft. You know that's not true. You know I've done nothing but serve this household with honesty and respect for the past 3 years. You call throwing yourself at my father respect? Julian's voice cracked, not with doubt, but with a fresh wave of disgust. Then, in a single, fluid movement, so swift it seemed to surprise even himself, Julian closed the final foot of space between them and struck her. His open hand connected with her cheek with a sickening, wet smack that echoed off the cold marble walls and the high, vaulted ceilings. The force of the blow sent Elara stumbling backward. She clutched her face, a strangled cry caught in her throat. A fiery, stinging pain radiated from her cheek, but it was nothing compared to the profound shock that seized her. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, flooded with tears that stubbornly refused to fall. Her chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths as a suffocating silence descended upon the grand atrium. From his chair, Arthur let out a weak, guttural moan, a sound of pure agony. You want respect? Julian hissed, his face a mask of cold fury, his own hand now tingling from the impact. He felt a flicker of something, regret, shock, but he buried it instantly under another layer of rage. Try earning it instead of crawling into my father's lap like some desperate gold-digging whore. Julian, stop, Elara whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. The tears finally breached their dams, streaming down her face, tracing a path over the rapidly reddening mark of his handprint. Please, you don't understand what's really happening here. I've seen more than enough, he growled, his decision hardening like concrete. Pack your damn things. You're done here. Get out. He punctuated the command with a sharp, dismissive jerk of his head toward the door. I want you off this property by sundown. Elara swallowed hard against the lump of despair rising in her throat. For a long, terrifying moment, she felt as if her legs might give out from under her, that she might simply collapse onto the cold floor and shatter into a million pieces. Then, a new kind of strength, born of desperation and a fierce, protective instinct, surged through her. Trembling, she dropped to her knees on the marble floor. Please, she begged, her voice thick with unshed tears. Please don't do this. I know how this looks. I swear on everything I hold sacred, Mr. Arthur is being hurt. He didn't want me to tell you. He was afraid. Her voice faltered as she risked a glance up at Isabel, who was watching her with a triumphant, venomous smirk. She yells at him when no one is around. Sometimes she locks him in his room for hours. I've seen her pour wine down his throat just to keep him sedated and quiet. Isabel's face went rigid, her perfect composure cracking for a fraction of a second. That's an outrageous lie, she barked, her voice sharp and brittle. She's lying, Julian. Can't you see what she's doing? She's just trying to save her own skin, creating a disgusting fantasy to deflect from her own actions. This is exactly what she wants, to divide us. Elara's hand reached out, her fingers clutching the soft fabric of Arthur's trousers. Please, just ask him, she implored, her gaze locking with Julian's. Ask your father. If you would just talk to him, alone. That's enough, Isabel cut in, her voice rising in panic. She rushed to Arthur's chair, physically inserting herself between the old man and the kneeling housekeeper. You've done enough damage, you little witch. Julian, we need to get your father out of here. He's clearly distressed by all this drama. She looped her arm through Julian's, her touch suddenly soft and consoling. Let's take him to the lake house for the weekend. Get him away from this toxicity. Julian looked down at Elara, still kneeling on the floor. Her face was flushed with shame, her body trembling from the violence of his slap, her voice shattered with desperation. She looked broken. And yet, somewhere deep in his chest, a cold, sharp sliver of unease began to take root. A flicker of something he couldn't name, a dissonant note in the symphony of his rage. Ilara met his eyes one last time. Her voice, barely audible, carried a sentence that would later haunt his waking moments and his dreams. "Sometimes the truth doesn't knock on the door, Mr. Croft. It bleeds." Then she turned away, pulling herself to her feet with a quiet, shattered dignity. Despite the tears still carving paths down her cheek, she squared her shoulders. Julian said nothing. He allowed Isabel to guide him toward his father. "Let's go, darling," she cooed softly. "Let's get your father somewhere peaceful." As they walked toward the grand entrance, Arthur turned his head slowly, his movements stiff and pained. He reached one frail, trembling hand back toward Ilara. His mouth opened. He tried to speak again, to form a word, a name, a protest. But no sound came out. Only a silent, desperate plea. Ilara stood there alone in the echoing silence of the atrium, watching the man she had tried to protect being led away by the very people causing his pain. That was the moment something fundamental shifted in Julian Croft's soul. But he wouldn't realize it until much, much later. Not until the truth began to burn its way out. The instant the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Julian and Arthur, Isabel spun around, the mask of concern vaporizing to reveal the venomous fury beneath. Her heels clicked like daggers against the marble as she stormed back toward Ilara, who was still standing in a daze, her cheek throbbing in time with her shattered heart. Without a word of warning, Isabel lunged forward. She grabbed a handful of Ilara's thick, dark hair, yanking her head back with a vicious tug. "You stupid little witch," she hissed, her breath hot and sour against Ilara's ear. "You really think you can plant a seed of doubt in his head and get away with it? I will ruin you. I will utterly destroy you." "Stop, please," Ilara whimpered, frozen by the sudden, brutal assault. The pain in her scalp was sharp and searing. Isabel leaned closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You speak one more word of this to Julian. One more word! And I will make sure your record is so stained, so filthy, you'll never get another job in this city. I will drag your name through every gutter. I'll make sure everyone you've ever known thinks you're a thief and a whore. You will be nothing. Do you understand me?" Ilara blinked back a fresh wave of tears, nodding slowly, her body trembling uncontrollably. Isabel released her with a contemptuous shove that sent her stumbling backward. "You should have stayed in your place," she sneered. Then she turned on her heel and glided away, the sound of her footsteps growing fainter as she disappeared up the grand staircase. Minutes later, the other staff members began to emerge from the woodwork, drawn by the echoes of the confrontation. Curious glances were exchanged, and whispers bloomed like toxic weeds in the oppressive air. "I heard she tried to seduce old Mr. Croft," murmured one of the younger maids, her eyes wide. "Are you serious?" said the chef, wiping his hands on his apron. "I always thought she was so quiet, so respectful. But who knows with these girls? She did spend an awful lot of time alone with the old man." Ilara heard every poisonous word, every speculative glance cutting into her like a tiny shard of glass. But she said nothing. She walked on legs that felt like lead to the back of the hall, toward the servants' exit. She collapsed onto a cold, hard bench near the door and finally let the tears fall. Not the quiet, dignified kind. These were the tears that break you from the inside out, the gut-wrenching, soul-crushing sobs you cry when you're not just humiliated, not just fired, but betrayed by the very people you risked everything to protect. And for the first time in her adult life, Ilara Vance cried like a lost and broken child. The last bloody rays of the California sun bled across the sky, casting a molten amber light over the sprawling estate. In the long shadow of Blackwood Manor, Ilara Vance sat motionless in the driver's seat of her beat-up 2008 Honda Civic, her fingers trembling on the cracked steering wheel. Her worn duffel bag lay on the passenger seat beside her like a dead weight, a pathetic summary of her 3 years of service. Her cheek still stung with the phantom heat of Julian's slap, a fiery brand of his contempt. But what hurt more, what was eating away at her soul, wasn't the physical violence. It was the look in his eyes, a look that had dismissed her, erased her, deemed her as nothing more than dirt on his polished $1,000 shoes. She had seen that look before. In the eyes of condescending teachers, dismissive doctors, and skeptical hiring managers. And now here, in the one place where she had foolishly allowed herself to feel a sense of belonging. A place where she had scrubbed floors until her knees ached, polished silver until her fingers were raw, wiped away the silent tears of a lonely old man, and cared for him when no one else wanted to touch the messy reality of his decline. She glanced back at the mansion, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes in the twilight. It was so big, so cold, so full of secrets festering in its opulent rooms. I should leave, she thought, her mind screaming at her to put the car in drive and just disappear. I should drive until the gas runs out and never, ever look back. But then she saw Arthur's face in her mind's eye. Frail, frightened, his hand reaching for her, his lips forming silent words. And she remembered what he'd whispered to her just last week, during a rare moment of clarity. You're the only one who still sees me, Ilara. The only one. Her chest tightened into a knot of painful conflict. If I leave, who's going to protect him? Who's going to stop her from drugging him into oblivion? Who will be his voice? Her hands clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She had every reason in the world to flee. No one would blame her. She had been publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and unjustly fired. And yet she couldn't. A stubborn, fiery core of defiance within her refused to be extinguished. To leave now would be to let Isabel win. It would mean that Arthur's suffering would continue, unheard and unseen. With a deep, shuddering breath, she opened the car door. She stood up, the cool evening air a balm on her hot face, and stared at the towering home one last time. Then, instead of walking away, she slipped back through the side entrance she had used countless times before. The servants' hallway was quiet, the air thick with the smell of bleach and leftover dinner. Most of the staff had finished their shifts and scurried away, eager to escape the suffocating tension. Ilara moved quickly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ducked into the small, windowless security room tucked away near the kitchen pantry. The room was always locked, but Natalie, the head cook and her only real friend on staff, had once shown her where the spare key was hidden behind a loose tile for emergencies. This, Ilara decided, was the definition of an emergency. Inside, the room hummed with the low, electric thrum of technology. A dozen screens blinked with live feeds from every corner of the estate. Ilara sat down in the worn office chair, the cold leather a shock against her skin. Taking a deep breath to steady her shaking hands, she began to rewind the footage from the past week. What she found made her blood run cold. There was Isabel, screaming at Arthur in the library, her beautiful face contorted into a mask of pure rage. There she was again, dragging him down the hallway by his arm when he refused to go to his room. And then, the most damning clip of all, Isabel, late at night in his suite, holding a bottle of expensive red wine. "Sign the damn papers, you old fool!" she was yelling, her voice a venomous hiss. "Sign them before I lose what little patience I have left." She then forced the neck of the bottle to his lips, pouring the dark liquid down his throat as he coughed and sputtered. Ilara's hands were shaking so violently she could barely operate the mouse. She copied the clips onto a small flash drive she found in a drawer. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do with it yet, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This couldn't stay hidden in the shadows of Blackwood Manor any longer. As she turned to leave, her heart still hammering in her chest, she heard the soft scuff of shoes on the tiled floor behind her. She spun around, a gasp catching in her throat. Julian was standing in the doorway, his brow furrowed in a deep, confused V. His tie was loosened, his jacket gone. He looked exhausted, defeated, and angry. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you to be gone by sundown." Ilara hesitated, her mind racing. This was it. The moment of truth. Run or fight. "I needed to make sure he was really okay," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You were told to leave," he repeated, taking a step into the room. Ilara didn't flinch. She pulled the small flash drive from her pocket and held it out to him, her small hand a beacon in the dim, humming room. "I found something," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Something you need to see." He stared at the small piece of plastic, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What is that?" "Proof," she said, meeting his gaze without wavering. "Proof that your wife has been systematically abusing your father and trying to steal his estate right under your nose. Then watch it," she challenged, her voice ringing with the conviction of truth. "And after you watch it, ask yourself why your father cries when he thinks no one is looking." He hesitated, his internal conflict warring on his face. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the drive from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and a jolt of something, static, awareness, fate, passed between them. The following morning, sunlight streamed gently through the panoramic windows of Blackwood Manor, but this time it did not feel oppressive or cold. The air felt lighter, as if a great, suffocating weight had been lifted. The silence no longer screamed with unspoken secrets. For the first time in years, the house had been stripped of its gilded pretense. Ilara stood outside the door to Arthur's suite, a small tray held steady in her hands. On it was a bowl of fresh oatmeal with a sprinkle of cinnamon, a vibrant assortment of fruit cut into perfect bite-sized cubes, and a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. She had chosen everything with meticulous care, not just for nutrition, but for dignity. She knocked gently. "Come in," came Arthur's voice. It was raspy, but there was a new note of life in it. She entered to find the old man propped up against a mountain of pillows in bed. The morning sun warmed his face, and his cheeks, so pale and sunken just days ago, had a touch of color again. His eyes, when they met hers, were clearer than they had been in weeks. "Ilara?" he smiled, a genuine heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "My angel." She gave a soft, self-conscious laugh. "You flatter me too much, Mr. Arthur." "I don't flatter," he said, his voice steadier than before. "I observe, and I remember." She set the tray down on the table beside him and expertly adjusted the pillows behind his back. Her movements were tender, respectful, imbued with a gentle intimacy that no hired nurse had ever offered him. "You're too kind," she said, tucking the crisp sheet under his arm. "Would you like me to read to you after you've had your breakfast?" He nodded, then his gaze deepened. "You saved me, Ilara. I was fading, not from old age, but from loneliness, from fear." She paused, her throat thickening with emotion. No one should ever be afraid in their own home. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Julian stepped in, dressed casually for once. No restrictive tie, no power suit, just a soft blue shirt and dark jeans. He looked younger, less like a ruthless CEO and more like a son. "Am I interrupting?" Arthur smiled. "Only breakfast. Join us." Julian pulled up a chair, but his eyes remained on Ilara. "How did he sleep?" "Better," Ilara replied. "No nightmares, no restlessness. I think the tension in this house was what was making him so sick." Julian nodded slowly, the weight of his guilt visible in his expression. "I believe that now." There was an awkward, charged pause. Then he looked directly at her, his blue eyes clear and sincere. "Ilara, I meant what I said last night. I want you to have full autonomy over his care. You will report to no one but yourself. Not the household manager, not me. I trust your judgment more than anyone's." She studied his face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. She nodded slowly. "All right, I'll stay. But only if Mr. Arthur wants me here." "I'd fire my own son if he tried to make you leave," Arthur said with a playful smirk. Julian chuckled, a real, unforced sound, but his smile faded slightly. "There's something else. I've hired a forensic accounting team to audit the estate's finances going back 5 years. If Isabel forged documents or tried to transfer assets, we'll know, and we will make it right." Ilara looked down at her hands. "She'll try to fight back. She won't go down quietly." "I'm ready for that," Julian said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "We'll protect you." 3 days had passed since Isabel Croft was escorted from Blackwood Manor in handcuffs, a single, silent tear tracing a path through her perfect makeup. But the scars she had left behind lingered like faint fingerprints on glass, hard to see from a distance, yet impossible to ignore up close. Despite the peaceful facade of the estate, a restless energy stirred in the corners, the ghost of years of toxicity. Ilara Vance moved with her usual quiet precision through the vast 2-story library, dusting the mahogany shelves and reorganizing books that hadn't been touched in a generation. Though she was no longer required to perform housekeeping duties, old habits had a way of filling the silence. Besides, Arthur was napping peacefully, and Julian was cloistered in his study, on a call with a team of lawyers. She paused when her fingers brushed against the spine of a thin, leather-bound journal wedged tightly between 2 heavy tomes on corporate law. The spine was faded, the edges weathered with time. Curiosity, a trait she had learned to suppress in this house, urged her to open it. Inside, delicate, looping handwriting sprawled across the yellowed pages. Isabel's handwriting. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she read the first line. "If Julian ever finds out what I know about his mother, he'll never forgive me. He might even hate her." Her eyes narrowed. What could Isabel possibly know about Julian's deceased mother, Eleanor? That would be so damning. She flipped through page after page. Most of the entries were bitter, narcissistic rants, venting about Arthur's stubbornness, Julian's emotional distance, and the crushing pressure of maintaining the illusion of a perfect high society wife. But some entries were different. They were coded, obsessive, and filled with a chilling ambition. One line stood out like a splash of blood on a white linen sheet. "The deed to the southern vineyard is hidden beneath the floorboards of the East Wing parlor." He doesn't remember signing it over, but I do. That land belongs to me now. A down payment for my suffering. Ilara's pulse quickened. She looked up, her gaze distant. The East Wing parlor. It hadn't been used since before she started working here. Arthur never went near it. Isabel had always claimed it was off-limits due to asbestos repairs, a story no one had ever questioned. Tucking the journal securely under her arm, Elara left the library, her steps quick and purposeful. Minutes later, she stood in the doorway of the East Wing parlor. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing through the grimy windows. Every surface was coated in a thick, gray film, and the furniture was shrouded in white sheets, resembling a congregation of ghosts. Faint cracks in the ornate wallpaper curled like dark veins. She knelt near the far wall, by an old, unused fireplace. Gently, she tapped the floorboards, listening. One of them sounded hollow. Taking a letter opener from her pocket, a tool she used for opening the estate's mail, she carefully pried the board loose. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, tarnished metal box. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside lay a deed, yellowed but official. It was stamped and signed by Arthur Croft himself, dated over 30 years ago. It gave full ownership of the southern vineyard to his wife, Eleanor Croft, not to Isabel. Tucked beneath it was another, more recent document, a forged transfer of ownership, with a signature that was a near-perfect, but not quite identical imitation of Arthur's. Elara stared at it, the full scope of Isabel's treachery dawning on her. This wasn't just about sedating an old man and taking over his estate. This was a long, calculated game of rewriting history, of stealing a legacy piece by piece, of erasing the woman who had come before her. She had to tell Julian. Now. She found him in his study, staring blankly at a spreadsheet, a glass of scotch sweating on the desk beside him. He looked up when Elara entered, his face weary but his eyes immediately attentive. "Is everything all right?" Elara walked forward without a word and placed the journal and the two deeds on his polished desk. "I found these. One in the library, and the others under the floor in the East Wing parlor." He picked up the journal first, flipping through the pages slowly, his expression darkening with each venomous entry. Then he picked up the deeds. His eyes widened as he compared the signatures. "This is my mother's. The vineyard was hers. She never gave that land to Isabel." "But Isabel was planning to use the forged document to make a case that it belonged to her," Elara said, her voice low. "Probably to sell it off before the family trust was reopened upon your father's death." Julian leaned back in his chair, stunned into silence. "My mother, she never trusted Isabel. She told me once. That vineyard was part of her dowry, from her family. Isabel knew she could never touch it unless she forged the chain of ownership." "She almost succeeded," Elara added softly. Julian stared out the window, the early afternoon sun casting sharp, unforgiving lines across his face. "You didn't have to go looking for this," he said, his voice thick with a complex mix of gratitude and shame. "You could have just taken care of my father and stayed quiet." "I could have," Elara replied, "but then you would still be living with a lie, and your father would still be haunted by a ghost he couldn't name." A new kind of silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective and profound. Finally, Julian spoke. "I want you to come with me tomorrow. We're going to the vineyard. I want to see it for myself. I haven't been there since I was 16. Elara hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I am," he said, his voice firm. "And I want my father to come too. He deserves to remember where we come from. Not just this house, not just the money, the roots." The next day, the trio made the 2-hour drive north, out of the city's suffocating grip. Arthur dozed in the back seat, occasionally mumbling fragmented memories of summer harvests, the smell of crushed grapes, and his wife's wild berry pies. Julian drove in a tense, contemplative silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Elara watched the scenery change, the glass and steel of the city giving way to rolling green hills, the concrete turning to rich, dark earth. By the time they arrived at the vineyard, The sun had dipped low in the sky, washing the fields in a breathtaking golden glow. The land was beautiful, more beautiful than Ilara had imagined. Endless rows of vines stretched across the rolling hills, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. An old two-story farmhouse stood near the edge of the property, its white paint chipped and weathered, but its structure proud and enduring. Julian stepped out of the car and took a deep, shuddering breath. "God," he whispered. "It still smells like her. Lavender and soil." Arthur's eyes, now wide awake, filled with tears. "She loved this place more than the city," he said, his voice thick with memory. "She said the air here healed her lungs." Ilara helped him out of the car. Together, the three of them walked to the edge of the vineyard. Julian stopped near a weathered wooden bench under a massive old oak tree. "I remember running through these vines barefoot," he said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "My mother would be out here singing to the plants, and my father, he'd be on the porch with his ledger, always worried about the numbers. But this place, this was hers." Ilara sat beside him on the bench, the breeze brushing loose curls across her face. "Thank you," Julian said, turning to her, his blue eyes holding an emotion she had never seen in them before. "You brought this back to me." "I didn't bring it back," she replied softly. "It was always here. You just stopped looking for it." He smiled faintly, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I had just listened to you that first day. If I hadn't—" He looked away, his jaw tight. "Struck you." Ilara looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "Pain often teaches louder than peace." Julian nodded, his gaze distant. "Then I hope I never stop learning." As dusk settled over the vineyard, casting long, purple shadows across the fields, they walked in silence. No words were needed. For the first time, Julian wasn't walking as a billionaire tycoon. Arthur wasn't walking as a fading, frail man. And Ilara wasn't walking as a servant. They were just people, bound by a complicated web of blood, by the harsh light of truth, and by the quiet, enduring land that had been waiting for them to come home. That afternoon, after they returned from the vineyard, Ilara walked through the garden alone. The air was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of jasmine and freshly turned soil. The same garden where she had once been harshly scolded by Isabel for lingering too long near the prize-winning roses now felt like neutral ground, its beauty no longer tainted by ownership or malice. She passed the shimmering koi pond, sat on the edge of a cold stone bench, and stared at her fractured reflection in the water. Everything had changed in what felt like the span of a single day. She had been humiliated, assaulted, threatened, fired, and then rehired into a position of immense trust, responsible for the well-being of a man who had once barely remembered her name. It didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. It felt like a responsibility, heavy and fragile. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from Natalie, the cook. "The staff has been asking about you. Many are grateful. They never dared to speak up, but they all knew something was wrong. You gave them courage." Ilara closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She hadn't done it to be a hero. She hadn't done it for courage or for gratitude. She had done it because no one else would. That evening, Ilara prepared Arthur for bed. He leaned heavily on her shoulder as she helped him out of his wheelchair and onto the edge of the soft, king-sized mattress. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, his voice a low murmur. "My late wife, Eleanor. She was strong like you, quiet but sharp as a whip. She saw through people, just like you do." Ilara smiled gently as she helped him swing his legs onto the bed. "That's the best compliment I've ever received, Mr. Arthur." She would have liked you, he murmured, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. Isabel. She never understood legacy. She only wanted the estate, the shell. But you understand what it means to care for something. For someone. Ilara covered him with the thick down comforter and turned off the lamp on his bedside table. "Good night, Mr. Arthur." He caught her wrist with a surprising strength before she could turn to leave. "Don't give up on my son," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "He's slow to learn, but he's not a bad man, just lost." Ilara nodded silently, her heart aching for this broken family. "I'll stay. For you." Meanwhile, Julian sat alone in his cavernous study, watching the security footage again. Not the clips of Isabel's crimes, but the earlier footage, the one from the day he had returned. He watched Ilara kneeling beside his father, her movements gentle, her voice firm, her patience unwavering even as his father struggled to breathe. He had misjudged her so completely, so violently. His own blindness and arrogance disgusted him. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Detective Nolan. Yes, it's Julian Croft. I need a full background investigation on all legal documents signed under Isabel Croft's name in the past 6 months. And I want to know who helped her. Someone on the inside did. I want names." He hung up and leaned back in his leather chair, the firelight flickering across his face. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel powerful. He felt accountable. The next morning, Ilara entered the dining room to find a fresh bouquet of white daisies on her breakfast tray, placed beside her usual cup of tea. Tucked beside the cup was a small, handwritten note. It read, "From one survivor to another. Welcome home. Arthur?" She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. Maybe this place was never meant to be her home. But maybe, just maybe, it could be a different kind of home now. One built not on lies and marble, but on truth. And finally, one where someone like her belonged. An hour later, Julian stood in the grand hall, his father seated beside him in his wheelchair. The entire household staff had been gathered, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and apprehension. Ilara stood across the room, near the foot of the staircase, her chin held high, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Isabel entered, flanked by her lawyer, a look of confusion and irritation on her face. "What's going on here? What is this circus?" Julian's voice was calm, but sharp as a razor's edge. "Isabel, we need to talk." She forced a sweet, condescending smile. "Of course, darling. But must we do it in front of the help?" "I've seen the security footage," Julian said, his words dropping into the silence like stones. The color drained from Isabel's face. "I know what you've been doing to my father," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I know about the forged documents, the yelling, the sedation, the threats." Whispers erupted through the crowd of staff. Isabel's eyes, now filled with pure hatred, narrowed as she glared at Ilara. "So she showed you, did she? The little servant girl finally played her hand?" "Your own actions showed me," Julian corrected her coldly. Ilara stepped forward, her voice ringing with clarity in the vast hall. "You hurt a man who trusted you, a man who gave you everything, and you treated him like a burden, like an obstacle." Isabel's face contorted into an ugly sneer. "You think I wanted to marry an old man's son just to play nursemaid to a dying relic? I have worked for everything I have. You think because I'm a pretty blonde, life was handed to me. I had nothing. I married him to secure my future." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Ilara. "And you with your quiet little mouth and your yes ma'am, no ma'am routine, you thought you could just sneak in and steal it all away." Julian flinched as if he'd been struck. Isabel screamed, her composure completely shattered. "You think I hate Arthur? I hate what he represents. His whole generation, men like him. They built this world only for themselves, and I took what I was owed." By now, 2 uniformed police officers had entered the house through a side door, called quietly by Julian after he had reviewed the footage for the final time. Isabel backed away, her eyes darting around wildly. "You're all just throwing me away, after everything I did for this damn family!" "You did nothing for this family," Julian said, his voice like ice. "You tried to own it." As the officers approached, Isabel didn't resist. Her fight was gone. She lifted her chin, her mask of cold composure snapping back into place. "This isn't over," she vowed. But as they led her away, her wrists bound in steel cuffs, no one moved to stop them. The silence in the hall was deafening, a vacuum where years of lies had once resided. Later that night, in the quiet study, Julian sat across from Alara. A fire crackled in the hearth between them. Upstairs, Arthur was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. "I owe you more than an apology," Julian said, his voice low and heavy with remorse. Alara didn't speak. She just waited, letting the silence demand more from him. Julian looked down at his hands. "I was wrong. About you, about everything. I let my anger, my arrogance, speak louder than reason. And I hurt you. Physically. I can't take that back. But I want to make something right." He slid a folded letter across the table. "This is an official offer. I want to hire you back, but not as a maid. I want you to be my father's personal care specialist and household advocate. Full medical support, full authority over his well-being, triple your old salary, no cleaning, no serving, just caring." Alara stared at the letter, then back at him. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who actually saw him," Julian said, his voice cracking with emotion. "The only one who listened. And I want my father to live whatever time he has left with someone who truly respects him." Alara exhaled slowly, the last of the tension leaving her body. "This isn't about the money for me." "I know," Julian said. "That's why I trust you." She nodded slowly. For the first time that day, something inside her began to ease. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to stay. Enough to fight. Outside, the sky was finally dark. But for Arthur Croft, and for Blackwood Manor itself, a quiet light had just been rekindled. The trip to the vineyard had left an unspoken understanding between them, something warmer, older, and more profound than simple forgiveness. But even as they returned to Blackwood Manor that night, the house still carried the faint, chilling echo of its darkest days. Alara slept lightly, her dreams scattered and thin like smoke. In the deep, silent hours before dawn, she was jolted awake by a sound from above her quarters. It was faint but distinct, the slow, measured, deliberate tread of footsteps. In the attic. There hadn't been anyone assigned to clean or store items in the attic for years. She slipped out of bed, grabbing a thin robe. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, prickled at her skin. She crept upstairs, her bare feet silent on the plush runners, past the darkened guest rooms, until she reached the narrow, hidden stairwell that led to the old attic. The wooden stairs groaned beneath her feet, each creak a tiny scream in the oppressive silence, as if the house itself was warning her not to proceed. But Alara had long since learned not to fear houses that whispered, only the people who screamed. The attic was cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and forgotten time. It was a graveyard of forgotten furniture, boxes of brittle holiday decorations, and yellowing paintings shrouded in white sheets. Moonlight, pale and ghostly, poured in from the small, circular window at the far end of the long room. She was about to turn back, dismissing the sound as the house settling, when something caught her eye. A large, leather-bound trunk tucked away beneath a dusty, moth-eaten tapestry. It was cracked open just a sliver. Curiosity, that persistent, dangerous instinct, pulled her forward again. She knelt down on the dusty floorboards and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were stacks of old documents, family photographs with faded, smiling faces, and at the very bottom, a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She picked up the top one. The envelope was addressed in elegant, looping cursive. To Ethan, in the event of my absence. Mother. Her breath caught in her throat. This was Eleanor Croft's handwriting. The letter had never been delivered. Her fingers trembled as she carefully opened the sealed envelope and began to read. My dearest son, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer able to tell you face to face the things I should have said long ago. You were born into a world of marble walls and golden ceilings, but you have a good heart. Never let this world make you hard. I know how much pressure your father puts on you to be strong, to be a leader. I know how much you want to be enough for him. You already are. Isabel is not who she pretends to be. She came into our lives with a calculated charm and a hollow heart. I know this because, in some ways, I once did the same thing to escape my own fractured upbringing. But I learned that a life, a true partnership, cannot be built on ambition. It must be planted in honesty and nurtured with love. I see the way you look past people, Julian. People like our Ilara. The kind, steady souls who carry so much grace, it humbles the very room they enter. Please, my son, if life ever gives you a choice between someone who wants your name and someone who sees your soul, I beg you to choose the latter. You are not your wealth. You are not your power. You are my son, and that has always been more than enough. With all my love, Mother Ilara's heart was thudding against her ribs now, a frantic drumbeat in the silent attic. She pressed the letter to her chest, the brittle paper a sacred relic, the words vibrating through her. She didn't hear the soft footsteps on the stairs behind her until Julian spoke, his voice a soft intrusion in the stillness. I thought I heard something up here. Ilara spun around, her eyes wide. Julian, your mother, she left you this. She held out the letter, her hand shaking. Julian took it silently, his eyes scanning the page. As he reached the end, his jaw clenched and a muscle twitched in his cheek. I never got to say goodbye to her, he said, his voice tight and raw with a grief that was suddenly fresh again. She passed away when I was away at university. I was too late. My father never mentioned any letters. She must have hidden it, Ilara said softly. Maybe she was afraid Isabel would find it first. He nodded slowly, the truth of it settling upon him like a shroud. She knew. All along, she knew. There was a long, heavy pause, filled only by the sound of their breathing. Then he looked at Ilara, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You're not just saving my father anymore, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're saving me too. Ilara offered a small, sad smile. I'm just helping the truth be heard. He took a step closer, the space between them charged with a new, unspoken intimacy. That's something we have never had in this house, he said. Truth, not until you. The next day, Julian gathered the entire household staff in the grand hall. The tension in the air was thick. Some were unsure if they would be reprimanded for their silence. Others still whispered about Ilara behind her back, their loyalty to the old regime dying hard. But Julian stood before them, his mother's letter a comforting weight in his jacket pocket. There are going to be changes here, he announced, his voice echoing in the vast space. The staff quieted instantly. I know there has been fear in this house. I know many of you have witnessed things you felt you couldn't speak about. That ends today. He turned and gestured toward Ilara, who stood calmly beside Arthur's wheelchair. This woman was humiliated, hurt, and threatened, and instead of leaving, she stayed. She stayed to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. That kind of loyalty doesn't deserve silence. It deserves our deepest respect. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each staff member. From this day forward, this estate will operate differently. No more whispers. No more turning a blind eye. If you see an injustice, you speak. If you are mistreated, you come to me directly. We are building a new foundation here, not on marble and money, but on integrity. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain, but no one objected. The shift in power was palpable. Julian then turned to Alara. Would you be willing to help me oversee this transition? I know you didn't ask for any of this, but I trust you more than anyone. Alara paused, considering his request. I'll help, she said finally. Not because I trust this house, but because I believe the people in it can still change. Arthur gave a quiet, proud nod of approval. That evening, Alara sat beside Arthur on the back veranda, overlooking the sprawling garden. The air smelled of lavender and damp earth. You know, Arthur said, his voice wistful, this house was once alive, before Isabel, before all the silence. It still is, Alara said gently. It's just waking up again. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. With you around, I think it's got a fighting chance. She looked at him, then toward the house, where she could see Julian through a window, pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. Already working on changing policies, rewriting procedures, undoing years of damage. I never wanted power, Alara said, more to herself than to him. I just wanted peace. And sometimes, Arthur said, his old eyes wise, peace only comes through people who don't demand it, but earn it. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through her dark curls. For the first time since the day she was dragged across the cold marble floor, humiliated by people she had once served with quiet dignity, Alara Vance didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was building. Something new, something honest, and perhaps, for the first time, something that was hers too.